Welcome to Garden Views, interesting conversations with interesting people who have done and or are doing interesting things. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome everyone into Garden Views, and our timing is often uncanny because today we are going to cover the law of conflicts, which some people at some point called war and its related subjects. Obviously, as we're recording, and this show will drop a couple days later, Russia has invaded Ukraine, its neighbor. And, without getting too much into the politics of that, we're going to try to stick to the law of that. But my guest today is an attorney in Maryland. His name is Julius Blattner, and I actually met him a few years ago. It's part of that group that I'm a part of. But this is the second time I'm seeing him in real life. Well, this is cyber real life. But Julius, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely happy to be here.
Perfect. Let me read you a little bit about Julius Blattner's bio, because it's very impressive. First of all, it's Captain Julius Blattner. He's a judge advocate in the Maryland Army National Guard. He served 2 combat tours in Iraq, with his most recent tour in 2017 as the Operational and International Law Officer with the 29th Combat Aviation Brigade. So thank you very much for your service, sir. Captain Blattner served as a legal advisor to over 20 U.S. Army commanders, leading combat aviation missions in support of the Iraqi armed forces during the purge of ISIS, some people say ISIL, from Iraq. Also in 2017, Captain Blattner trains Army soldiers deploying overseas on the laws of conflict and the rules of engagement. Captain Blattner is a graduate of Salisbury University and the University of Baltimore School of Law, our big rival here in Baltimore. I was a Maryland grad, so big football rivalry there. He has a Master of Arts from Liberty University and is a graduate of the Army's Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. He's presently activated with the National Guard as a legal advisor to the Maryland Army National Guard's commander and staff. And when in active service, Captain Blattner owns and operates the Blattner Family Law Group in Towson, Maryland, where they help people with contentious divorces, protecting their finances, and to maximize time with their children. So we have a real Renaissance man here. So listen, again, thank you again for your service and for everything you've done. And there's actually I'm sure he's got lots of interesting stories, but we're going to start with the open-ended question is, what is the law of conflicts?
The law of armed conflict is a set of laws that all nations in the world have agreed to be bound. And so you've got the United Nations, made up essentially of all the countries that the United Nations recognizes as being members, and they've all signed onto this agreement as to what rules nations are going to follow when at war. But that really came about after World War II. There was this idea that there are certain ways that the nation states should conduct themselves when fighting in wars. Like wars people were just so, it was just so brutal. And they just thought, we need to be more civilized in the way that we engaged in armed conflict. And so there was a set of rules mainly to protect civilian populations, people that generally as a society, as a world that we recognize really should not be the target of armed conflict. And so really it came out of the travesties of World War II that we said, there's certain things that we're just not going to accept as part of armed conflict. And so we've kind of got this United Nations where everyone's signed on and said, we agree to this. The interesting thing to note is that a lot of our armed conflict, at least with the United States, has been with what we call non-state actors. Right. And so they're basically not a recognized nation or country. If we're looking at terrorist groups or groups that the United States has deemed to be terrorist organizations, they're generally not recognized to be a government of a territory. to have sovereignty that's recognized by the rest of the world. So a lot of what I do as a international and operational law advisor is trying to figure out how do we apply international law to non-state actors. That's really because it wasn't designed for that. It was designed for how do nation states treat each other. What's interesting about the current conflict is that we actually have two nation states engaging in armed conflict. You got Ukraine and you got Russia.
Mm-hmm.
This is different than what happened 8 years ago when, as we look at it now, we say that Russia annexed, parts of Ukraine. But really, at the time, that wasn't the narrative. At the time, you had groups that were backed by Russia. It wasn't actually Russia as a nation state. They were groups within Ukraine who basically they decided that they wanted to side with Russia. But in this case, it's actually the country, the nation state, Russia, acting overtly by invading and crossing over the border of Russia. So I guess the other interesting thing is that there's a concept of proxy wars. And essentially what that means is that you can have nation states basically engaging in armed conflict through proxies, meaning that they support various groups. They arm them. And so, the groups themselves are doing the fighting and the dying, but they're being endorsed, sponsored by a particular nation state, whether it's Syria, Russia, United States. And so you basically have this conflict going on, but there's a restraint there because they're not actually a conflict between Russia and the United States, but by proxies. And that's essentially what happened. There was a proxy war where Russia was supporting kind of, were they Russian soldiers? Were they soldiers of this other group? It's not until now that we're kind of looking at it differently with this perspective that basically Russia annexed this group. Russia doesn't share that same narrative as we know from Russia's leader. He's actually recognizing their independence and declared it for the first time as being separate from Ukraine. And basically his justification for the use of force is that he is looking to neutralize Ukraine in order to defend what he's declared to be independent nation states. So it's just interesting because even Russia recognizes that there is some type of international law that applies, so much so that the leader even provided a legal justification as to why he believed he was in the right in doing what he's doing.
Well,
so
it worked once before, so why not go to the same playbook again?
Right. I just think it's interesting because before, he was doing this kind of through this proxy war, which is why a lot of conflicts are like, even with the warfare in Iraq, you've got groups who are backed by Iran. So you've got conflict happening through non-state actor groups, but they're being funded and supported by actual sovereign nations. This is an overt actual government of a country, nation, actually making an overt effort to actually send troops. So it's very different. So it actually is a scenario where now international law, there's no question as to whether or not this is a place where we can apply it because we have two state actors in an armed conflict. So academically speaking, it is very interesting to see this play out legally.
Unfortunately, though, I think what we've been finding more and more is that international law tends to be applied mostly to those who, are weaker than the ones trying to apply it, or a coalition of the willing. And at the end of the day, Russia is one of the 5 seats on the Security Council with veto power. So, I'm sure you're going to get to that at some point, but that's sort of where the rubber meets the road, I guess, with the UN, right?
It is. So it is interesting. So after World War II, there was 5 permanent seats. So you got United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and the United States. And they're basically the superpowers that basically came from the end of the World War II. And so you've got the 5, and then you've got the 10 others, which are temporary members. It's like a 2-year rotation of other members of the United Nations, but you have those 5, and any one of the 5 can veto any type of resolution, United Nations resolution. So that's part of the challenge, is that if any one of those five are the main, I guess, offenders, that really they have a lot more leeway to do things because they can always veto. So that's always been the challenge in these types of conflicts, is if Russia or China, veto, then it's really difficult for the United Nations to pass any type of resolution.
Or any country of those five. I mean, it could be the United States, could be France, could be the UK, for whatever their reasons are, which I'm sure from other countries' perspective has happened. I don't want to sound too, USA, though I am USA and I tend to be USA. But we do have an international audience, at least potentially. Now, under this convention of armed conflict, I know that Russia invokes something called Article 51, which is, as I understand it, that any member state can request assistance from another state if it feels it's being threatened by yet a third member state. And that's sort of what you were talking about with, I think Donbass is the name of one of the regions. The other, I think, is Luhansk or something.
Yeah, Luhansk, yes.
And he's saying those are breakaway republics, but they are not members of the United Nations. So Article 51 actually doesn't apply. And in our line of work, it would be called moot. Their party's not in an action, and they don't have standing because they're not a member state to request assistance. So it's sort of a fabrication, sort of doing it backwards. First, they'd have to become member states, and then they could request the assistance, whether it was a pretense or otherwise. At least then they'd have the standing to do it. So, I think after a week, if it hasn't been months or years of, sort of Russia's nonsense on this, I think we know the narrative and the fabrication here. But, even their technical legal justification is based on a false premise, which doesn't even apply to the legal framework here. Hope I expressed that correctly.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that this is structured, because it really relies on the collective effort by the world nationally in order for this to work. It's kind of this like agreement that everyone agrees to be bound by, but if a nation doesn't agree to be bound by it, like we have the International Court, right? But it's only as strong as the enforcement mechanism, and the enforcement mechanism is again back to a UN resolution to enforce it. But in order to enforce it, one of the steps is to get a vote by the 5 permanent members, which in this case, again, we've got Russia as one of the members. So the enforcement mechanism of any ruling by the court is also going to be problematic because of Russia's standing as one of the 5 permanent members. So, but yes, to your point, they're not legally recognized nation states. I think the justification there, at least from Russia's perspective, is that I guess they feel that because Russia's recognizing, them as being independent territories, that's sufficient. That a nation state recognizes the sovereignty of these 2 areas as being sovereign. That whether or not that holds, and whether or not that, the scrutiny of the court, I guess that's for the court to determine. But that's essentially it could be a weak argument, but that's the argument that they have. If he's going to his legal advisor and say, how do I make this work? And they say, look, we can make this argument. It's not great, but we don't really have much else. So you're just thinking about being attorneys. Sometimes you have a weak argument, but that's all you got.
I guess they have their own precedent against them in that I think that Chechnya called itself it's a breakaway republic, and now there's basically a puppet government in Chechnya, and it's wholeheartedly part of Russia, and I think there's another breakaway republic that's pro-Russian, Transnistria, which or maybe is anti-Russian, that they haven't recognized. It's in Moldova. I guess it's in Moldova, depending on who you talk to. Anyway,
one of the things too, that I keep in mind. So as a military advisor, one of the things that we do is we try to understand what the commander's intent. That's a big thing as a military advisor. So when we're providing legal advice, we want to know, what is the commander's intent? What is his goal? What is he trying to accomplish? And if we can, we try and find a way to basically make sure that we do things in such a way that it's legal, right? And so we say, look, if you do it this way, then it's not legal. But there is a lawful way of doing it, and sometimes that takes some creativity and some thinking. And a lot of times that's what we do as legal advisors in the military, is we try and think of ways to make sure that it holds up to scrutiny.
We do that sometimes in regular practice as well, though the stakes are usually not as high, or if ever.
Right. We're not looking at war crimes.
True.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if this is your expertise or not, but that sort of brings us to when the UN isn't enough. I mean, in this case, most of the world seems to be mobilizing in one direction and then imposing sanctions, and everyone seems to be on board, and they're doing it, outside of the UN, they're doing it on their own or through the EU, or, but there's other international organizations, regional treaties and organizations. Most prominent in this discussion is probably NATO. So do you have any expertise in NATO and how any of their rules or might apply to this situation?
Yeah, so NATO, North Atlantic Treaty, really has to do with this idea of collective self-defense. So they've essentially signed a treaty saying if any nation within the NATO is attacked, it's to be treated as if it's an attack on any, an attack on one is an attack on all.
That's Article 41, right? That we hear about a lot.
Oh, this is the NATO, the actual NATO treaty that the countries have signed on to. So if you'll notice, the United States is part of NATO.
Yeah.
And when you hear about our troops being deployed or activated overseas, they're activated basically in the countries that surround Ukraine, but not actually in Ukraine, because Ukraine's not currently part of NATO. So we'll have troops in Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, because they're all part of NATO. So if there's an attack on any of those countries, then we're obligated to basically defend those nations. So we're within our rights to be in those countries, and it's not considered a violation of their sovereignty because we're there by consent. So going back to this idea of conflict. So if we're going to engage in armed conflict, it's either going to be through a UN resolution, meaning that the United Nations has signed off on it, or through self-defense. And then you've got two types of self-defense. You have the self-defense of your own nation, and then the also collective self-defense. So in the idea of NATO, you've got a treaty basically saying if one nation's attacked, then it's the same as if all of us are attacked. And there's a obligation under this treaty for us to defend these other countries, which Ukraine doesn't have, which is why we're not mobilizing forces in Ukraine at this point, because we don't have any obligations by treaty or otherwise to do so.
Right, and it could escalate the situation. It would escalate it maybe beyond where it needs to at this point. We are members of other collective security agreements as well. Isn't there a Pacific one, and probably maybe some others as well?
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of number of different treaties and agreements that we have with other nations. We also have partnership agreements that are outside of our NATO treaties, and those partnership organizations, we work with those nation states in training their military, and we do cross training with them in terms of just exercises, engagement. We've got exercises that we do with South Korea. We've got exercises that we do in Europe. So we definitely certainly have different agreements with each of the nations that we work with.
Okay. Now, Congress has the ability to declare war. I don't know the last time our Congress actually declared war. And so we have, anything that seems like a war not declared war. Sometimes it's under the auspices of a treaty or UN collective action, which I guess means that it's been delegated to the executive branch, and Congress can either fund it or not. But there's police actions and the War Powers Act and items such as those, which are, sort of, I guess, compromise measures to give the executive branch some power to act independently of Congress. Maybe it's a way to let Congress off the hook sometimes. That part of it probably doesn't matter very much for our discussion. If I had a congressman on, maybe, or a congressperson on, I'd ask them about that. But for your purposes, I mean, do you ever have to make distinctions on declaration of war versus War Powers Act or anything else that are there other acts that I'm not aware of that play into this?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So, and that's part of why they don't call it law of war anymore, because it's been so long since we've declared war, but we've been in a constant state of armed conflict for so long that the terms really evolved over time. So interestingly enough, and this is kind of a big discussion point in legal circles, is our, I guess, what we once termed the global war on terror. And essentially it started after 9/11. There was what's called the authorization for use of military force that was passed by Congress. It was intended specifically to respond to 9/11. But that basically act that was passed by Congress has been extended over and over, essentially for our global war on terror, which was retermed to be overseas contingency operations. It was this idea that we were not at war with any one particular sovereign state, that we were at war with terrorists, and they could be anywhere in the world. And it's interesting because there's this concept about self-defense that you can defend yourself in other territories so long as the government is either unable or unwilling to address the threat. And so that's why we find ourselves, with strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, right? It's like, well, why is our drone strikes and we assassinated or killed that one leader that was tied to Iran in Iraq? We hit them with a missile. How are we able to have these isolated strikes? Well, the idea is that we've recognized that the government is either unwilling or unable to address this threat to our nation as this global threat. And so we've kind of have this like extraterritorial armed conflict that, the international community is not thrilled with, but because it's, I guess, limited so much in scope that a lot of times, nations, I guess they just don't really do much about it. But it's something that's really not talked about as much as maybe it has been when it started. It seems to be a little more commonplace and people don't really think too much of it. But it is interesting that it's a different way of looking at this concept of self-defense, that it's not limited in geographically to any one particular area.
It's very broad. As you said, it can be anywhere. And, in some of these countries, not all, there tends to be something that approximates a civil war. So, parts of the government or parts of, groups may support it while others don't. And, so there's no cohesive, unified voice saying, hey, stop dropping missiles in our yard. But also, I think you're right. It's just become something that's so commonplace that we're numb to it here. Numb might not be the right word, but we're not really impacted on any sort of large scale in the consciousness here of the United States. And I mean, it is a democracy, and the votes count, and public pressure and polls and politics matter. And I guess if people here aren't particularly concerned about it in large numbers, there's not a lot of motivation to change.
Well, we didn't. I mean, think about it. We went into another sovereign state when we, went to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. And that was a sovereign state. They have certainly borders, a territory, a government, but we didn't necessarily ask for their permission. We executed a mission within those borders, and we just did it,
sure.
Right? And so it's one of those things where it's like it's become almost precedence or practice in certain nations that we've said, look, that they don't have the ability to address the threat, and so we have to address it for our own protection. Even though the United States geographically is further away, we've still identified this as being a threat to either our troops at home or our troops are abroad.
Right. And we also have other cooperative like operations with, like narco. There oftentimes there's U.S. troops assigned to South American and south of the Rio Grande North American countries with law enforcement and military operations in other countries, and that probably happens around the world also. And that, I mean, it probably doesn't feel like a different situation to the public, but it's a different situation when that government invites you in, to be a part of that task force or joint operation. However they decided to agree. I mean, that's probably the subject of some discussion oftentimes. But when they ask you when they invite you, and it's, I guess, as you say, it's consent.
Right, it's by consent, right, and so that'll be governed by whatever status of forces agreements reached between the nation states.
So when we had troops in, I know we had troops in Ecuador for a while, probably not a lot, but right. Then the former president said, "Get out." So I think they all left, and the next president may say, "Come on back," and maybe they'll send more back in there. They could probably use the currency. Well, I mean, they use U.S. dollars there, but they could probably use the people with the income and to build up sort of community towns and economies. Anyway, so recently you had to deal with this on the domestic front, which had to be sort of unusual, probably a little scary, but Julius is probably a pretty humble guy, and he didn't tell me this himself. Someone else told me, another lawyer told me, he said, in the aftermath of January 6th, that they asked, that Julius was the guy that they went to in Washington, D.C. to ask about use of force. So literally, he's the one who gave them instructions on when they could and couldn't take a sidearm out of its holster and things like that. So I don't know if that was an exaggeration. That's exactly right. If it was beyond that. But, we were talking in pre-production. I said, maybe it didn't feel cool at the time, but now I'm like, that's super cool. You were the guy. I mean, you were the guy making those decisions. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So shifting gears. So we're going from international operational law to domestic operational law. And happy to speak on that. Some very different. We're talking about how do we use military forces domestically, and really the use of military forces domestically, unless it's some type of military state, is going to be your National Guard. So that's something that you'll hear a lot about. The governors are in control of the National Guard, and in emergencies, we call on the National Guard. There's a reason why they don't call active military to do these types of missions, because under the Constitution, the National Guard is only authorized, it's a military to do that. And so we have a very unique domestic state mission that the active component doesn't. And I say that is because they don't really have to do a lot of the legal considerations on the active Army side for how to deal with domestic operations. And so that's an area of expertise that's really kind of unique to a National Guard judge advocate. So my first experience with this in terms of civil unrest was in 2015 with the riots in Baltimore. So I was activated for that. Funny enough, I had a 2-day jury trial that morning that settled, and I left Baltimore City and headed to gear up to head back into the city for the response to the riots. So that was kind of our first dealings with the rules for the use of force. So there's a difference. So overseas, we talk about rules of engagement. We're talking about enemy combatants and how do we engage enemy combatants. And then, you come back on the domestic side, we're not looking at enemy combatants. We're looking at U.S. citizens. We're looking at, how are we treating our own people, right? So the rules are very different. We use different terminology. We're not talking about the enemy. We're just talking about U.S. personnel. We're talking about rules for the use of force. And it also goes back. I remember we were activated after Hurricane Katrina, and I went down to Mississippi, and it was just, trying to get rule of law under, and we were issued weapons, and I wasn't a lawyer at the time, but we were issued weapons and we were provided guidance in terms of, when we were allowed to use it. But in 2015, we briefed soldiers before they went out on the streets on, this is these are the different scenarios, and this is the level of force that you're allowed to use. And, you got to remember that these are, we're in our own backyard. These are our people. We're not in a village somewhere in a foreign country. This is Baltimore City. These are our people. So that was one of the things, is just trying to keep perspective, because a lot of these people, they don't have experience, being mobilized in their own cities. So when DC happened, we got activated. We got called in the next morning. We're there in DC. We're on the ground.
Can we back up just a second? Because it's in DC and you're in the Maryland National Guard.
Yes.
And I assume DC doesn't have a National Guard because it's not a state, where they don't have a governor that can activate the National Guard. So how, that had to be some decision or some, quick, how was authority designated to the governor of Maryland to activate the Maryland National Guard to have this type of domestic law enforcement role in Washington, D.C.?
That's a great question. And that's, as a JAG, that's what's one of the first questions we ask. Who's authorizing this? Who's requesting it? How is this being? There's a few different ways that this can happen. This can be happen through authorization from the president, the Secretary of Defense. This can come through a request from DC themselves. This can come as a request from federal agencies. And so, the federal agencies can make a request. Also, there's interstate compacts between states and DC. So DC does have its own National Guard, but the scale of which they needed soldiers, they would not be able to fill. So depending on the request, dictates where the funding comes from. Is this going to be federally funded? Is this something that's going to be state funded with reimbursement? So there are a lot of legal questions in terms of who's in charge. Is the governor in charge, or are these soldiers going to be falling under the authority of the president? So those are all the questions we're asking, because in order to apply the law, we need to figure out, does state law apply, does federal law apply, whose jurisdiction, who's in charge, and all this has to be determined pretty quickly. And a lot of times what happens in these types of operations is that we get what's called VOCOs, like vocal commands, that basically say, this is the authority, this is what we're going to do. We're still working on the paperwork. It'll come later. So, but they're just trying to give some guidance in advance so that we can go ahead and get troops on the ground. But there's so much that goes into it. Where, who's funding this? How is this going to get paid? And who's in charge? And those types of things. But yeah, I remember the attack happened. My boss, my supervisor, the state JAG, she sent me a message. She says, "Have you heard anything about, the Maryland Guard getting activated?" Well, I checked Twitter. I saw the governor tweeted, National Guard's getting activated. I said, "Ma'am, there it is." So, our tag reports straight to the governor whenever he declares state of emergency or activates the guard. And so, yeah, I think there was a request basically for states to volunteer National Guard. What's that? Our adjutant general, he's our 2-star. Basically, he's in charge of General Gowan. He's in charge of the National Guard in Maryland.
So the commanding officer for the National.
He's the top commanding officer. So yeah, that was it. We were in DC, and part of my job is to train soldiers on. We did scenario-based training. In these types of scenarios, this is how you'd respond. These are your, this is your weapons posture. Are you carrying it? Is it stored? What's the threat level? And a lot of the scenarios were just like, people are approaching, what do you do? How do you respond? How do you react? So yeah, that was primarily what I was doing, was just training soldiers on how to respond to, different levels of threat.
Well, it's great that you were there to be a steady mind and to make sure there were steady hands. I can't imagine. I mean, obviously the Capitol Police bore the brunt of the main assault. Everyone else was mobilized afterwards. But I keep thinking about like a guardsman, and that the QAnon shaman comes to mind, because of course he does. Basically you have a Viking with red, white, and blue coming at you. Someone needs to tell you how to deal with that. It's probably been a long time since one's been faced with a berserker. So I don't know. I guess that would be a taser situation or whatever. But I'm glad it wasn't me who had to make those decisions, as is a grateful country. I don't even want to go any further with this and indict myself. So we have the domestic, which is unusual, not entirely unprecedented, but on that scale, it isn't, and hopefully not to be repeated. But I guess experience creates precedent, and something that turned out in the end to be, the deployment led to no problems that I'm aware of. So that was, I guess, a successful mission, right?
Yeah, it was. It was absolutely a successful mission. We remained there through the inauguration, provide security for the inauguration, and then we were recalled back to Maryland. Many of us to support the mass vaccination efforts that were that the governor's initiative had started back. It was early in February of 2021.
How are you able to balance this with running a law practice, especially a law practice that you're doing? I mean, I don't expect the audience to be largely lawyers or any lawyers, but contested divorces may not be the most difficult legal wise, but they're certainly among the most difficult emotion and needing to be available 24/7. And that's not to say that they're not difficult legal wise either. They are, but people wise and things with everything with kids is a big deal. So you can be called up at any time. You've been called many times within those years. I mean, I'm sure courts and opposing counsel are very understanding of the situation. There's probably laws that say they have to be as well. But still, how do you deal with it?
Interestingly enough, National Guard judge advocates who practice on the civilian side is not, I guess, common enough that Congress or even our legislatures really contemplated. There's rules for people who serve in the legislation, like if there's a conflict or something like that they can get out of cases. But there's protections for service members who are parties to a case, Service Member Civil Relief Act.
Sure.
But actually doesn't apply to attorneys. If you read it, really, it's whether or not you're a party to the case. So there has, for the most part, attorneys and judges have been understanding and supportive, but there have been some cases where, there's just an advocacy thing, or maybe the court's not truly understanding like what's happening, that I've had to really, hey, I've been activated, need a postponement wasn't enough. I really had to kind of dig in and say, hey, like, I really don't have a choice in this. Like, you're forcing me to either subject myself to court-martial for being absent without leave, right? Or being in contempt of court for not showing up for a court.
Now, could you say to them, I have been ordered and you are obstructing judge. So now I'm authorized to arrest you, judge.
Yeah, no.
No, it doesn't work that way, huh?
No, I'm not so bold, but it's part of
Is that even a theory though? Is it even?
I just found myself in that situation. I was like, what am I supposed to do? I'm literally on orders of the military that, I can't help. I didn't know this was going to happen. I didn't know yesterday that the Capitol would be attacked, and today I'll be in DC. Right. So wild.
I mean, is it a better theory than making up the two republics that don't exist and belong to the United Nations, asked you to intercede on their behalf? Is saying, Your Honor, I'm a law enforcement duly appointed by the governor, and you're obstructing that. Is that a better theory than the Donbas one?
Just depends on the judge, right?
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, you have to be political. You're still a practicing attorney, but yeah, and probably will be for a long time. So yeah, that's going to be the. How do you manage it time-wise?
So I got activated for the first time. I've been on active orders for a majority of the last 2 years. I got activated early March for COVID when it first got kicked off. I had a hearing in Howard County. It's always how it starts off. I have some hearing, and then I got to call, Blattner, we need you to report, some emergencies happening, and you're going to be away for a while. So it's unexpected. I was at that point. I got back from Iraq in 2018, so I started my practice over again. So my practice didn't survive my activation to Iraq. So I started over. I had gotten to the point where I had some support staff, but early 2020, I was in trouble. I was trying to find contract attorneys, just trying to find people to cover for me while I was away. And so right now I've actually got some staff attorneys that fortunately help. Now, with me being activated, it doesn't cripple the firm like it did before. I've got some clients who understandably are not as happy, but for the most part, I've had to postpone most everything where I have to be in person, but a lot of just the litigation piece I do in the evenings. So
that's gonna be fun.
Yeah, no fun. It's if I could just get an extension on that discovery request, I'd really appreciate it. Maybe a couple extra weeks.
Well, don't become a podcaster then. It takes a lot more time than you might think. And
that's amazing that you do this. It's wow,
it's not amazing. It's not amazing at all. It's for me. It's fun. I have no hobbies. I have no friends. So this is it. This is it. This is everything. Right now, you're my 17th best friend just from the scope of this conversation. I know you're honored. So when you were deployed overseas in combat zones, what kind of decisions are you asked to make?
So any type of military action, which is there's two types. There's your basically planned military actions, and then there's your reactive, right? So if you're acting in self-defense or the defense of others and it's authorized, these are your rules of engagement, then really it's your call. It's your call because it's your life at risk. But any type of deliberate attacks will have to be signed off by a judge advocate. So you have these operational law judge advocates, and a lot of times there's planning involved, and there's a lot of considerations that go into it. So in a deliberate attack, we have to figure out, how certain are we that this is the enemy? How certain are we that this is a military objective? This is not a church. This is not a hospital. This is, what's the collateral damage assessment? If we strike this military building, are we blowing up, families of children and, women? Is this, you're not going to get to the point where you're not going to have any collateral damage, but the idea is that you've got to minimize it. And so those are some of the legal, analysis that we're required to go through in determining whether or not a military objective is legitimate. And so prior to any type of deliberate attack, you're going to have a judge advocate sign off on it that says, we're good to go. We've received the intelligence checks out. To a certain degree, we believe this to be a legitimate military target.
Would this include? I'm sorry, finish up.
What's that?
I'm sorry.
So that's so for every missile strike, that we do that's deliberate. It's not like in, self-defense. That's really the process that goes through it. We have to make sure that, and then once we've provided our legal opinion, once we've said, this is a legitimate military target for a legitimate military purpose, we'll provide a post operations report that goes along with it, so that if there's any type of investigation, they'll see our legal review and analysis and the information that we based our legal opinion on.
Does this, I think that you already answered it, but I just want to be specific. Does this include drone strikes and cruise missile strikes, things like that?
Absolutely. Yeah, drone strikes and missile strikes. We're able to see the surveillance. We're able to see the live feed on what's happening before it happens. Now,
I imagine that the drone strikes are mostly from the Air Force equivalents, Air Force JAG, or the Navy.
No, we have our own. The Army has its own. Its own drone.
Interesting. I probably should have known that, but why? Oh my goodness, I did. There's something I really did want to ask you about. I don't think I can let you go without asking you. I know that for a while, and this recycles itself periodically, but there's always people outraged about the border, and mostly the southern border, because the border of Montana doesn't seem to be a big problem these days. And, people always put troops on the border. And then we hear something called posse comitatus, or I'm probably mispronouncing it, but, explain some of the complexities of why it's not so easy just to put troops on the border, or is it? Can the Texas governor activate the military or the Texas National Guard to stand on the border? But the border itself is federal, even though it's also the Texas border. So I don't know, maybe you can help us untie that knot a little bit or make some sense of it.
Yeah, so posse comitatus, right? So that's the restrictions on using the military for law enforcement purposes.
Right.
But those restrictions don't apply to the National Guard, which is why the National Guard is always being utilized. And, civil unrest, anytime you see any type of civil unrest, National Guard and state active duty capacity can serve a law enforcement purpose because it's governed by state law. So once we become federalized, so that was one of the interesting that happened. I'll get back to your question, but one of the interesting things that happened last summer was with the Black Lives Movement, with the civil unrest that was happening. You saw National Guard being activated all over the country, basically to support law enforcement in quelling and some of the unrest and protecting the First Amendment rights to peacefully assemble. And so, that's not something that your active military can do because of posse comitatus, but doesn't apply to the National Guard, and basically the states activate them. Interestingly enough, this was a legal issue that came up is under the FEMA mission assignment, which is basically the authorization for the National Guards to be federally funded. We were being federally funded for the purpose of supporting COVID. And so that was our big thing. We stood up COVID to basically do these testing sites and to provide support to civilian organizations and agencies because of just how widespread and the big impact that the COVID had. Well, what happened that summer is we had all the civil unrest come up. And the question is, can we use soldiers who are federalized, funded by the federal government under the FEMA mission assignment in a law enforcement capacity to address potential civil unrest and law enforcement? Well, the answer is no, because under the FEMA mission assignment, we weren't authorized in any type of law enforcement capacity. So we had to either transition soldiers back to a state active duty status or activate a separate group of soldiers specifically for the purpose of using them for law enforcement purposes. So it became this kind of interesting legal issue that we really didn't have to address before. But that being said, it really depends on the funding source and depends on who's activating. So activating the National Guard to stand on the border is not really difficult either by the federal government or by the state. It just depends on whether or not Texas wants to use their state funding for that. States prefer the federal government to fund it.
Sure.
It doesn't come out of their budget. So that's one of the considerations. Even here in Maryland, when the governor activates National Guard, there is always a hope that, in some way or form that maybe the federal government will reimburse in some way the cost for an emergency or something like that.
Understood. Yeah. I mean, you can always follow the money at some point. Is the use of force for the Texas National Guard or the Arizona National Guard or whatever, the Montana National Guard in Canada, guarding against Canada, is it basically the same? Would it be the same rules of engagement that you would have instructed people in DC a year ago?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So every state has their own rules for the use of force.
Really?
For the most part, it's similar, but the escalation of force, like the scenarios in which you would use either deadly or what we call lethal, non-lethal, or less than lethal, depending on the type of weapon that's being used, really depends on each state and how each state's laws on their militia and those types of things. So, but they're similar enough that, there's not too much variation in terms of what we're allowed to do. But in DC, we were bound by the DC's rules for the use of force. So part of it was basically you had all these different states who had their own rules for the use of force. And what was interesting is so many of these states had activated their National Guard to respond to civil unrest in the summer of 2020, that it wasn't that long before they were activated again to go to DC in January of 2021. So a lot of these soldiers were coming in thinking, oh, I know the rules. Like we've already been there, done that. Like we've done this. But it's like, well, no, actually, guys, there's a different set of rules here in DC, and this is actually the rules that you're supposed to follow.
We're inside the Beltway, but it's a different Beltway this time.
Right.
So what happens? I mean, are you standing there along with someone from, let's say, the DC Police Officers Union and someone and like the chief of police or commissioner of police, and they're telling you what the use of force things are, and then you are interpreting, making a snap decision and making it, or is this hashed out in a conference room or whatever beforehand? Like, I mean, you can't be expected to know DC use of force when you're activated that morning and you have to get there that afternoon.
Right. So that was one of the things is we had to, we actually got our own briefing from the DC National Guard on the rules for the use of force.
Okay.
There's published guidelines that go through the command channels, and then each soldier is provided what's called a rules for the use of force card. It's kind of a cheat sheet of what the rules are. And they're each given briefs. So they're given briefs about, this is the rules for the use of force. And then we go through the scenario-based training. So this is the application. So this is what it looks like in real life. It's usually, there's a roster sheet. So like every unit, different components will say, okay, at a certain time, we're going to meet here. You're going to gather your troops and we're going to do a training. You'll have a roster sheet where each soldier signs off saying I've received this training. They have a rules for the use of force card. And then we also created a video for them to watch so that anytime they went out on missions, they would watch this video to remind them, okay, these are the rules for the use of force. So they had their card that was on them. And then they had the actual training and the video training. And then I would also train the leaders in terms of, when you're making decisions on behalf of your troops, these are the types of things that you want to be looking out for.
Very interesting. Okay.
And the other thing that's interesting too is that one of the things that we have to do anytime soldiers get activated and we're arming them, we have to screen them to make sure that they don't have any type of domestic violence or that they don't have anything that's going to preclude them from carrying a firearm. So it's called a Lautenberg. Basically, if you've got some type of felony or some type of domestic violence related issue that doesn't allow you to carry a weapon in Maryland, you're precluded from carrying a weapon, in your
named after Senator Frank Lautenberg, right?
Right, and that could apply to protective orders. Sometimes you get protective orders where the court will order that they give up any weapons and not allowed to have them in possession. So that's one of the things that we have to do is we have to do those checks before we issue any weapons to.
What if it hasn't been adjudicated yet? What if there's just charges or there's an OOP but it hasn't been decided?
Right. I mean, if it's pending, it's really just a commander's discretion. They may have a policy that says if it's pending, but it's not going to be excluded by Lautenberg. It's just going to be a policy, but a policy enforcement.
Okay, a lot of discretion with the commander. That's similar to what Andy Gross said. Your show is going to drop before us, but listeners, Andy Gross is going to be one of the episodes probably the next week or in 2 weeks. I'm sort of doing things. 3 shows I think are going to be related that I want to drop sort of back to back to back. But I want to start with this one. But that's a preview. It's Code of Military Justice as part of that show.
Yeah, it's very new and developing, especially in Maryland. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
So we have 5 branches of the military, and we've got the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. So technically the Marines is part of the Navy, but maybe it's not. But now we have Space Force. So does Space Force have JAGs as well?
They do. They do have JAGs. We actually had a couple members of the Space Force actually join us in DC, but I don't know really too much about them.
I'm a Space Force simp. I'm so desperate to be part of Space Force. I've done everything to be part of Space Force except apply to Space Force. So I've done everything except anything, but I really want to. The Coast Guard used to be the 5th branch, but now it's under the Department of Homeland Security, which implies it's more of a federal law enforcement safety agency or entity rather than part of the armed forces. I know at some point they had JAGs because I actually did apply to the Coast Guard JAG.
Yep, Coast Guard JAG.
About 100,000 years ago. With canoes, it was different. So what is the Coast Guard now? Are they still under the same military rules, or are they under a different sort of law enforcement rule, which may or may not be similar? I mean, I don't even know.
Now that's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure, how they fall within like the kind of, whether or not they still fall under the Uniform Code of Military Justice or not. It's a good question. I know each of the branches have their own regulations in terms of how they prosecute it, but yeah, it's a good question.
That's now another thing I need to look into, which means I need to find a Coast Guard JAG. I mean,
find a Coast Guard JAG, right? Yeah,
I'm not going to look into it myself. I'm going to find someone who already knows the answer and call it a show. That's my gimmick here. I learn things by claiming I have a show. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't?
No, actually, it was good because I was able to actually make some points I didn't think of. But yeah, no, it's been good. So, but we covered both. Overseas, international, operational, a little bit of domestic. So I got both of those in there.
Excellent. Good. Please tell the folks where they can find you, promote whatever it is that you would like to promote. This is a free guest promotion zone.
Absolutely. So you can find me on jmblattner.com. That's my website, my family law website. And you can, just reach out to me there, send me a message. Happy to chat. I talk with a number of either law students who are interested in becoming JAGs or other attorneys who are interested in becoming JAGs. They have questions. I'm always happy to talk about my experiences and, a little bit about the process and becoming one if that's something people are interested in doing.
Excellent. Terrific. Okay. I'll give them a Twitter or Facebook, or no, that's enough. Just that's the law school.
If you Google my name, Julius Blattner, I'm not hard to find.
Okay. Very good. Fair enough. So again, thank you for your service. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for answering all the questions. At the end, I got you with one you couldn't answer, but you're not in the Coast Guard. So,
yeah, I do want to say this because I probably should have said this in the beginning, but all of my opinions are my own. They don't reflect the opinions of the federal government, the National Guard, the Army, Department of Defense, Department of the Army, any of those government entities. Are my own opinions.
Me too, except mine represent my private Space Force, which is to be differentiated from the United States Space Force. It's the evil dose Space Force of the Darker Order of Tartarus. But that's one of my other alter egos that probably belongs on a different show, not this one. Again, thank you very much. Thank you for participating. Really enjoyed it. Very interesting stuff. So timely. I feel so fortunate that you answered the call even before this stuff blew up. Bad analogy, I suppose, a bad choice of words there, but so timely and so relevant. And so I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of really good information on all this. So thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your night. I see you're still in your office, so I guess you're going to be doing your legal work.
Yeah, I got some legal work to do. But yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to spend this time in chat and talking about something definitely interested in.
Great. Terrific. Again, thanks again. And folks, thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. Please share the show with all of your friends, family, enemies, whatever. Please rate and review. You can do that on Apple and Spotify now. 5 stars would be lovely. A review would be lovely. Good one, preferably. That's it. You'll get another show next week on Garden Views. Also, check out Garden of Doom. To get Garden Views, you have to subscribe to Garden of the Doom, so you probably already know that, unless you just sort out this show itself. And if you like pro wrestling, then you probably don't. But if you do, check out Hammerlock Hangover. So everyone, take care, and we'll hear from you next time.